Hello, my name is Dominique Kamara, and in this screencast, I'm going to be thinking through a technique that I'd like to use in my classroom that was suggested in one of the videos that we watched about how to basically teach grammar, or what I'm calling syntax here, through natural patterns. As natural English speakers, we don't have to learn grammar so explicitly because it's something that we've acquired over many, many years through multiple exposures to the language. And this is something that I'd like to purposely try to do within my history classroom. So this is a skill that I think would be useful not only for the English learners in my class, but for all of our students, because within the context of the history class, they encounter language in a more academic sense, or often in a way that they haven't encountered outside of the history classroom. And these are some of the comic syntactic challenges that I've seen students have thus far. This is just a quick list that I kind of came up with on the spot. In reading, passive verbs really tend to throw them off. When they're writing, I've seen a lot of students challenged with the syntax of how to integrate citations into their essays. And then when they're speaking, a lot of students have a hard time incorporating the use of those more abstract and conceptual nouns that end in things like ism, like communism, or ation and ization. Those types of nouns are really challenging for students to use. Additionally, they have a hard time connecting complex sentences with multiple phrases that might show different relationships, like cause-effect relationships, sequencing, or compare and contrast. But for this example, I'm going to be focusing on how we can target passive verbs in their reading to help students better understand what it is they're reading about. So I think the first step in kind of naturally getting students to see these patterns form is to first identify the pattern. So I just took a little excerpt from one chapter reading. This comes directly from the text, and it says, "Caste was used to determine how a native population could best serve British rule." Here we see that the verb "was used" is applied in a passive sense. And a lot of students come to me when they encounter this type of verb tense and they're like, what's going on? I don't understand what the sentence is saying. And that's reasonable because what a lot of students don't realize is that passive sentences, they change the order of how the action is happening so that there really isn't an actor in this sentence. The subject and the verb are switched. So we see that the object of the verb actually comes first, and it's really lacking a subject. So to make this point more clear, I would expose the students explicitly to more examples of the same pattern. And all of these examples come from the same reading. So we already saw the first example where you say "caste was used." We have the second sentence that says, "When troops refused the orders to load rifles, they were dismissed." So we see again that passive voice where we've got a form of the verb be followed by a past participle ending in ed. They were dismissed without pay or imprisoned. And then finally, the third example says farmland was turned over to growing cash crops instead of food. So the question that students should have in their mind is, well, who did these things? Who is the actor in these different sentences? And I hope that through exposing students to the passive voice in a very deliberate way, it will get students to practice forming questions. So there are two ways that I could see myself using this natural pattern forming technique. One way would be to actually get students to replicate this type of language. So they see multiple exposures of the language and then they try to make sentences that look the same as that. However, in this case, this is not what I would do because English teachers and in general, we encourage students not to write in the passive voice simply because it can be very confusing. So in this case, I would actually be trying to expose students to this tense in order to help them form questions. So in this case, I would ask them then, well, what information are we lacking? How could we turn this passive sentence around into a question? So maybe they could form question frames like, well, okay, the caste system was used. Well, who used the caste system? Another question could be, who dismissed or imprisoned the troops? And finally, I would give them that same frame to be able to ask that missing information. In history texts especially, I think, this is just my own prediction, that the passive voice is often used as a way to simply present information that is not known. So sometimes, especially when we're dealing with ancient civilizations, we simply don't know who made these discoveries or who created these different things in society. However, a second reason that the passive voice can be used can be to basically hide who the actor is. And it can be a form of bias that we encounter within our text. So I hope that this type of close investigation of the syntax within their text can help them to understand that there is bias embedded within their textbook. So of course, the answer to all three of these questions, who did these things? Of course, it was the British. So this is just one technique that I might try using to help students with their comprehension in reading by paying close attention to the syntax. Overall, though, I'm still left with a lot of questions. I would like to know more about what I can do to become more aware of these different syntactical situations that might present challenges to students. I'd also like to know whether there are any teaching resources already out there that have identified the type of morphosyntactical patterns that might be specifically encountered in a history classroom. And then finally, my last question is, because my students really struggle with building complex sentences, I was wondering how I might be able to incorporate the use of sentence frames, the linguistic tool of sentence frames, to better describe what's going on in these situations and help them become better writers as well. Thank you for listening. That's all I have to share.